खोजो 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 खोजो.
Now that was an interesting conversation, wasn't it? Let's go ahead further from here now. Let's talk about the pandemic. Of course, Earth would be incomplete if we do not talk about the pandemic. You would agree that pandemic is far from being over. And however, at the same time, India's response to it is definitely commendable. And the next topic that we will diverge into is a panel discussion. And this one is titled as Battling the Virus, India's Unique Response to the Pandemic. So please join me in welcoming the panelists for the same. To begin with, please welcome Dr. Randeep Guleria, who is the Director, AIIMS, New Delhi, March 2017 till date. He was awarded the Padma Shri in 2015 in the field of medicine. Along with him, we have Dr. Gagandeep Kang, who is a professor, physician scientist working on vaccine and public health, particularly focused on children and enteric infectious diseases in India. She established laboratories to support vaccine trials and conducted phase 1 and 3 clinical trials of vaccines, a comprehensive approach that has supported 2 Indian WHO pre-qualified vaccines. She is an elected fellow of all the Indian Science Academies, is the first Indian woman to be elected to Fellowship of American Academy of Microbiology and to the Royal Society. Along with them, we also have on the panel Dr. Chandrakant Laharia. Dr. Laharia is a medical doctor and India's one of the leading public policy, vaccine and health system experts. His work on epidemics and pandemics is a unique blend of academic research, field responses and policy work. He is the co-author of Till We Win, India's fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. He is the youngest fellow ever elected to the Indian Public Health Association. This session will be moderated by Dr. Anand Ranganathan, who obtained his BSc Honours degree in chemistry from St. Stephen's College, Delhi, after which he left on a Nehru Centenary Scholarship for Cambridge, UK, where he obtained his BA in Natural Sciences, his MA and his PhD in his PhD. Scientific contributions from his lab have been published in peer-reviewed journals like the Journal of Biological Chemistry, Chemistry and Biology, the Journal of Infectious Diseases, and Nature Communications. So let's go ahead and get into this topic, which is definitely one of the most relevant topics as of right now. Let's do this right away.
Thank you very much. I think I can begin now. I see Dr. Guleria as well. Welcome, everyone. And it's a real pleasure to be moderating this session along with Dr. Laharia, Dr. Guleria, and Dr. Kang. The session title is a pretty interesting one. It says, Battling the Virus, India's Unique Response to the Pandemic. And by the looks of it, the second wave is possibly upon us. We truly are battling it. But as the title suggests that we have possibly had a unique response to this pandemic. So maybe I think the good place to start would be to go around our esteemed panelists and ask them if, in their view, our response merits being called unique, or is it the same response that other countries, especially in the West or maybe developed countries in the East, have had. Let me begin by Dr. Gagandeep Kang. Do you feel that our response has been unique, Dr. Kang?
Well, Anand, the principles of public health were established in the 14th century with how you handle diagnosis and isolation. That's something that we have been familiar with for a long time. So if we look at the test, trace, isolate approach that we have taken, it's something that the entire world knew and has done appropriately. In terms of shutting down societies, the lockdowns, we've seen that the Indian lockdown was the most stringent of them all, but it is a strategy that other countries have taken. But if we are to think about what is different about India, I think the fact that India is a vaccine supplier to the world and is now beginning to help other countries to control their pandemics. And much of the world is much worse off than we are even today. I think the fact that we are reaching out, that we are donating vaccines, that we are enabling other countries to receive vaccines in, I think, what is a much more generous way than other vaccine producing countries have done. I think that really is a remarkable part of India's response.
Yeah, in fact, on vaccines, we'll come to a bit later. In fact, there's a satirical website called Foxy, and it had a uproarious headline saying India fast running out of countries to supply vaccines to. But we'll come to how effective the vaccination policy has been in our country, whether we need to step it up and remove the comorbidity clause that is over 45. But let me now turn to Dr. Guleria, who has been at the forefront of our COVID response. Dr. Guleria, do you think India's response has been unique compared to other countries?
So I think we did follow standard protocols as public health measures are concerned, but there was a few things which are unique as far as our country was concerned, which may or may not have been there as far as the Western world was concerned. The first thing was that there was a very good alignment between, I would say, the political bodies, the policymakers, and the scientists in getting things done, whether it be the lockdown, whether it be creating COVID centers, COVID hospitals, and looking at how we could really ramp up things as the pandemic evolved in our country. The second, I think, unique thing that India was able to do was we were able to really show that our country is very resilient, because we started off with a situation where we had really nothing. We were importing most of the things that we were needing, whether it be N95 masks, whether it be PPEs, whether it be kits to do the RT-PCR testing, even things like the viral transport medium or the swabs, the nasal swabs. Most of them were coming from outside. Many of them were being imported from China. And we had a situation in a pandemic where nothing was coming from other countries. You had to do it on your own. And there we were able to show a lot of resilience. A lot of people who were not in this business came forward, and we were now in a situation where we have no shortage of N95s. We did a project way back in March, April, where we were thinking of how can we recycle N95s and PPEs in case there's a shortage, can we reuse them? And we created a room with a fogging machine so that we could use PPEs again after we hung them up, cleaned them and hung them there for some time so that they got disinfected. So that was the challenge that we had at that point in time. But we came out of that. We even started manufacturing ventilators. So I think there was a lot of learning that we were able to do, which was unique. Other countries also did that. But in India, where we had resource constraints, we still managed to do it very, very well. And we also moved into a lot of R&D, as was mentioned. We produce a lot of vaccines, but we're not very strong in doing a lot of vaccine research and then being able to collaborate with industry in a big way. But that was something that many groups were able to do. And because of that, we have now a number of vaccine candidates which are there being looked at in clinical trials in our country. So those were the learnings. And I think whatever we have learned over the last 1 year, I hope we are able to sustain that learning and take it forward as we move in the coming years. Because there was a lot of learning which really taught us as to how we can build a more resilient and self-reliant nation.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, there's no doubt what you say is very true, that we were importing a lot of stuff that was needed for us to combat this pandemic in exactly 1 year ago. And now we are exporting a lot of that stuff. That includes the vaccines as well. So I think we've really ramped up our infrastructure. But I think after I'm done with asking the same question to Dr. Laharia, I would come to you, Dr. Guleria, to ask you that if we've shored up our infrastructure so well, and indeed we have, so many more hospital beds, so much more preparation for going into combating COVID. Why is it that just today, many cities like Bhopal, Indore are once again going into lockdown? But I'll ask that of you later. First, initial opening comments from Dr. Laharia as to whether ours has been a unique response compared to other countries.
So when responding to this question, we also need to remember that the challenges to the country are also unique. So then we have to identify local solutions. So that's make unique challenges and unique responses. For example, country did not have sufficient testing kits. So India did real innovation of pool testing where you use limited resources to identify the cases. So that kind of interventions were done. But also country had a challenge if we look unique both in good and bad senses. The challenge which country faced in terms of migrant crisis when they were on the streets and highways was also unique to the country. And then in the mid of the lockdown, the approaches need to be found out and ultimately resolved. So there were unique challenges and unique solutions need to be found. That's one. Second is, of course, for a country the size of India, when health system is really varied across the states and across the settings, the number of states came up with different ideas, and that helps. So I would say that, for example, in social sector, education of children, there are a number of settings where there is no access to internet or mobile phones, but then country found the different ways of approaches to solve, and now situation is returning to normal. So on health sector, two innovative things, vaccine supply and production and the way rollout, and also hospitals getting ready for this situation was unique. But in other sectors also, India has done something unique. But that was only to respond to the challenges which were there. Finally, I would like to say that in the pandemic, we do not look for a unique solution. We look for the solution which will address the problem. So to answer this question, probably we need to revisit a year later again, whether we address the problem or not, but unique or not, I would maybe keep my judgment for the later.
Right, thanks very much. I now return to Dr. Guleria, and here I ask him that if indeed it is absolutely true that we've shored up our infrastructure so well, brilliantly, in fact, in many cases, so many more hospital beds, thousands of beds. In fact, we have COVID trains as well. The PPE, we are now net exporters. We have now the serological testing, and we've ramped up our RT-PCR testing. So everything is, all the infrastructure is there. Why is it now that, Dr. Guleria, we are going into another lockdown, many cities?
So you're right, that is true that we are seeing a resurgence of cases. There's another spike that we're seeing, and there are multiple reasons for that. I would like to say that the first reason is more related to behavioral change. Most people now have started saying that since the vaccine is there, COVID is over, and they have stopped wearing masks, stopped having physical distancing or washing their hands. There are huge parties that we see where people don't wear masks, and there is no physical distancing. There are big crowds collecting, and any of these crowds or places can become what we call super spreading events, and that can lead to a huge surge in the number of cases because the virus has not gone anywhere. The virus is still there in our community. And we also know that based on the serosurveillance data, a majority of, I would say more than 70% of our population still is not protected. The vaccines will protect them, but that will take some time. So we still are a vulnerable group. And if we start not having COVID appropriate behavior, it will lead to a huge problem in terms of the virus spreading more rapidly, especially among those who are vulnerable in terms of immunity. The second issue is, and that's more related even to the action that has been taken, we were very aggressive last year in what we would say was our policy of testing, tracking, and isolating. Anyone who was positive was really, his close contacts were tested, they were quarantined, or if they were positive, isolated. There was aggressive testing done, even the rapid antigen test was used. Most states have stopped doing that right now. That whole aggressive policy of testing aggressively to pick up cases early, the policy of tracking all of those who were close contact of that individual so that you were able to pick up people early and prevent transmission to others, has also had a lot of laxity. That has also allowed the virus to really spread. And that is also causing a huge increase in the number of cases. So I think these are the two main factors that we are seeing a surge in the number of cases. We need to be vigilant. We need to really work aggressively like we did last year in looking at clusters, developing containment areas, and aggressively following the policy of having these containment areas really close so that they don't allow the infection to spread to other areas. Somehow we have reached a stage of what I call COVID fatigue, and therefore we are not doing things as we were doing in the past, and it's sort of causing a huge surge in the number of cases.
Right. So you mentioned that people are getting a bit lazy and not adhering to the COVID norms. In your medical opinion, do you think with these 4 state assembly elections now coming up, do you think all these political rallies where lakhs of people accumulate, there is no social distancing, no one's wearing masks, do you think Election Commission should cancel these rallies?
So that's a difficult question because it has a lot of other sort of connotations. But from the health point of view, we should avoid any event where you will have lack of physical distancing and people will not wear a mask, because that can lead to a spread of the infection, and therefore that is something that needs to be looked at. We are seeing a huge surge in the number of cases, and in these states there has to be a lot of very aggressive COVID appropriate behavior has to be enforced. And at the same time, like I said, testing, tracking, isolation, treatment has to be looked at more aggressively, because the more testing you do, the more contact tracing you do, the higher the number of cases you will be able to pick up and prevent them from spreading it to others.
Right. I'd like to now turn to Dr. Kang and ask her a couple of questions. I think they're very pertinent and she's the right person to answer them. First question is, Dr. Kang, if you could explain it to our, the people who are watching this, why is it that this virus, and in fact, all virus infections, they come in waves? Why do they subside? I mean, the pool was already there, people were infected, and it's not that, we had a drastic change in temperature. Why is it that the infections or the infection rate went down to nearly absolute zero, and then now it is shooting up? So why is it that these viruses, they come in cycles and waves?
Viruses depend on being able to transmit to susceptible populations. And if you look at society and who's susceptible within a society, you need a certain number of individuals entering into a space where transmission is possible. In many viruses that have been with us forever, this is new births. Children are vulnerable because they have not had prior exposures before. And in the case of new viruses like this that come into the population, you see the virus first go through the population that has the highest degree of social mixing. So if we had not had a lockdown, the people who mingled most with other people would be the people who would be most exposed and have the highest rates of infection. And then as society opened up after the lockdown, so first post-lockdown, we saw a rapid increase in cases. And here again, it was going to be people who were going to be the frontline workers and healthcare workers who were most exposed. You may remember that post-lockdown, we were reporting very heavily on all the police personnel who were getting infected, and that's to be expected. Now we are seeing a wave of infection of all the people that were not infected the first time around, because society has pretty much gone back to what were normal behaviors. So people who were protected during the initial period and therefore uninfected are now being exposed and having that infection. Now,
so,
after
sorry
a
to interrupt.
while,
Sorry to interrupt. So are you saying that the wave nature is because of the reaction of the people who are infected or who are going to be infected?
So the wave nature varies by virus and varies depending on the transmission mechanism. So if we look at something like influenza, influenza is very seasonal. It's dependent on how the virus survives in the environment as well as the mixing between humans. So we tend to see influenza with winter seasonality in the Western population, a post-monsoon peak also seen in places like India. And that's really dependent on how people are mixing and when the virus is around. If we see waves for enteric viruses as well, noroviruses and rotaviruses also occur in waves. This again has to do with the survival of the virus and periods when people congregate. So in the West, many viral infections are winter infections because people are indoor at that time. So it is a combination of virus survival, which is dependent on environmental conditions, and social behaviors that determine disease waves happening. COVID was unusual because, it's a virus that needs to settle down. Once it settles down, I think it's very likely that we will start to see a seasonal pattern with that as well.
Right. Thanks very much. In fact, I want to devote a lot of time to the vaccine, the success as well as the controversies surrounding it. But before I do that, I want to ask Dr. Laharia, because this has been bugging me. And in fact, Dr. Kang can also jump in after Dr. Laharia is done with it, which is that looking forward, what should be the government's response? Because it always bugs me that we all had this SARS-1 virus in 2003. And the spike protein of SARS-1 is very similar to the spike protein of SARS-2. And I remember many of my colleagues had actually started, making or designing vaccines against SARS-1. And they had applied for grants, and that some of them even got the grants, and they'd started on the spike protein. But by the time they could, move sufficiently into the research, SARS-1 actually disappeared. And with it disappeared all this hankering for having a vaccine against SARS-1. And with it disappeared all the government funding and, all the razzmatazz is a wrong word to use, but, with every pandemic, there's a kind of what do you call it, a wake that comes along with it, a lot of exposure. And everything disappeared. SARS-1 disappeared from, our consciousness. Now, the thing is, if we had a SARS-1 vaccine, maybe in the initial months, 6 months, 5 months until we got to the SARS-2 vaccine, that could have saved millions of lives, given the fact that there was, cross-reactivity, and the antibodies that were formed against spike of SARS-1 could have also bound to spike of SARS-2. So, Dr. Laharia, do you feel that, in responding to pandemics, global pandemics, the governments take a very short-sighted view? They don't think 10 years ahead, 15 years ahead. Do you think that needs to change?
You are very right in saying so. However, when we are talking about the vaccines, why a particular pathogen is selected for development of vaccine and why other is not selected, this is a global debate. And we know in the last 2 decades, there have been a number of viruses which have emerged, which were termed public health emergencies of international concern. Ebola, Zika, Nipah, and there had been some efforts to develop vaccines against those, but there is another dimension, that which population and which countries are affected, and that fairly determine how the global community comes together to develop vaccine. However, Dr. Kang is a member of that Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovations, and which was formed in 2017, and which that kind of global coalition has essentially contributed to accelerate what we could achieve the COVID-19 vaccines in this pandemic. So that's a lesson that if we think ahead in the future and we collaborate and work together, much could be achieved. So that's very important point. You are very right that we don't think in the future. And in this pandemic, we have also learned that countries are thinking of their own, and there is not enough global solidarity or looking to take care of others. So there are some other lessons which were always known and have been once again thrown out in the public. So we need to think again nationally, globally, together to prepare for epidemics and pandemics, because we know that virus and pathogens are here for many billions or millions of years before human beings. and they will be there, and human beings will also be there. So we need to think of how to prevent future epidemics, pandemics. We also need to think that what, as a human beings, wrong things we are doing, which are making us more vulnerable. And since all of this is happening, of course, right now we are in the middle of the pandemic, and immediate priority is to fight pandemic. But alongside, we need to, there had to be some mechanism that we do not forget the moment we are out of the pandemic, and remain ill prepared as we were for this pandemic. So definitely a lot more solidarity for future response required. Over to Dr. Kang. I guess she would.
Yes, before I do, because I'm not noting down, I think there are like important buzzwords coming out of this wonderful conversation. And one thing that you mentioned, Dr. Laharia, was global collaboration. So I'll save that and ask on that to Dr. Guleria. But Dr. Kang, your response: if we had SARS-1 COVID vaccine or SARS-1 vaccine, do you think we could have saved millions of lives before the SARS-2 vaccine came along?
So Anand, you will be very pleased to hear that the reason that we could move so quickly with SARS-CoV-2 vaccines was because we knew so much about SARS-CoV-1 and had vaccines in development. It is because the spike structures are so similar, the conformation of the spike is known, its binding characteristics are known. So pretty much once the sequence of SARS-CoV-2 was made available, people looked at all the data that they had from SARS-CoV and said, we can predict what's going to work, and were able, therefore, to design vaccines very, very quickly, just tweaking a little bit to make the changes for a vaccine that could fit SARS-CoV-2. And in fact, you may be even more interested to hear that the vaccine that is being developed by Biological E is an original SARS-CoV vaccine. And it's relying on the fact that the receptor binding domain of both the viruses are so similar that we are anticipating a reasonable degree of cross protection. And that vaccine is in phase 1 trials. But couldn't agree with you more. Had we gone further with SARS-CoV vaccines, we would have had more tools available to us much faster.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for saying that in the end, because I was about to interrupt to tell you that that's a bit of an academic cop-out, because you're absolutely right. We've learned so much from SARS-CoV-1 structure and, everything to help us develop, mechanisms to combat SARS-2. But SARS-1 was in 2003. We could have easily had a vaccine till 2010-11. In fact, it could have helped us in the MERS epidemic as well. Or it wasn't really a global pandemic, but it could have helped us in the MERS thing that happened 2011. But going forward, do you think, as Dr. Bagai has mentioned a lot of times, that Indian government and other government need a specific body, call it a pandemic response body, like you have National Disaster Response organization? Going forward, we really need a bunch of policymakers, scientists, and perhaps politicians to come together and be, absolutely focus on just pandemics.
I think Randeep will have the answer to that. He's been doing this for 15 years.
Right. Okay. So, Dr. Guleria, you can answer that, but I'm going to couple that with a question of my own, which was the buzzword that I took from Dr. Laharia, which is global collaboration. And it kind of fits very well with, dare I use this word, Atmanirbharta. But in science, it is very different. I mean, science does not look at any borders or nationalities, and most of the things that we have to admit that we use in science and medicine in India has been developed outside or possibly in collaboration. But here is the thing: when we talk about collaboration, it's all very well, but if you look at the response, or especially the scientists' response to SARS, most of the vaccines are actually not a result of global collaboration at all. I mean, I'll take the example of Moderna or Pfizer. I mean, these are done by, a couple of scientists who, for example, working on Moderna, who got to know the public sequence. I mean, that was made public, the genome sequence of SARS. And with overnight, they designed the RNA, and then they put the vaccine to test. So do we really, do we now really push for global collaboration, or we gave more resources to our own scientists, because ultimately R&D, as this pandemic has shown, is not really a result of global collaboration. Even if we look at, for example, the Covaxin, which is Bharat Biotech in collaboration, not with a foreign entity, but ICMR, ultimately it has been fructified by using techniques that are 30 to 40-year-old, I mean, inactivation by beta-propiolactone and things of that sort. So there is no global collaboration. Now, which is the model that you're looking for going ahead? Global collaboration, or again, I use this word, Atmanirbharta?
So coming to your second question, I think it has to be a combination of both. There has to be global collaboration because viruses don't look at borders, and therefore when we are seeing that the virus is going to spread at a global level, people at different parts of the world have different expertise, and unless we're able to bring that all together, we will not be able to move rapidly in terms of development of various newer platforms as far as vaccines are concerned. But at the same time, you need to really have support for your own national researchers in terms of being able to develop things locally and give them that support, whether it be in terms of infrastructure, whether it be in terms of job satisfaction and sustainability, of being able to work on this and be able to develop these platforms and vaccines and other even drugs or molecules for any viral infection as early as possible. Because like you said, the pandemic did show that there was a lot of global collaboration, but at the end of the day, it also led to national or people at various parts looking at their own country to really take it forward based on the support and the funding that they got from that government. There is a lot of investment which is involved, and that becomes the biggest challenge. And therefore, coming to your first question, it's something that we need to keep in mind because we've been talking about having a group look at outbreaks and pandemics for a very, very long time. This happened after the SARS outbreak and also after bird flu, H5N1. And H5N1 is a virus which luckily does not have sustained human to human spread, but it has the capacity of case fatality of over 60%. That is very high mortality. And there was the data from two labs, one from in Europe and the other in the US, which showed that you just needed two mutations in this virus for it to become a pandemic virus in terms of being novel and having sustained human to human spread. So there was a lot of concern, and and vaccine was actually made for H5N1, and it was actually stockpiled by various countries. But since there was no pandemic, there was a whole debate as what to do with these vaccines. They were given to farmers in Indonesia so that they could vaccinate themselves, because poultry workers in Indonesia, because this was predominantly a disease happening in poultry workers as far as humans were concerned. There was also then talk of having a virtual stock of vaccines being created by asking the industry to really have availability of vaccine and thereby being able to manufacture it if there was a need at a large scale. All of this has actually led to what Gagandeep is involved in right now in terms of global collaboration and trying to really take it forward. But a lot needs to be done, because what I've seen is we talk about it a lot and we really push for it a lot when we have a pandemic. I've seen this happening during H1N1, the swine flu pandemic. A lot of concern, a lot of issue of why doesn't India have a monovalent H1N1 vaccine? But once the pandemic wanes and things become better, let's say the will and the let's say the financial support tends to wane, and that causes a problem in the long run. So we need to develop a strategy where there is sustainability, there is support for research in this, even if it doesn't lead to much. H5N1 didn't become a pandemic, but we need to be prepared, because that doesn't mean it can never become a pandemic. And that type of research and sustainable development needs to be done. And you're right, we need to get not only scientists, but policymakers and politicians on board to understand this. More often, the committees that we have are basically scientists who really do a lot of work and then put this forward, but it never gets taken up at a level that it should be. So I think this pandemic has really shown us that we will have future pandemics and we need to be prepared, whether it be vaccine, whether it be infrastructure, whether it be upscaling our facilities for testing. All of that we need to work on so that we can do it rapidly in the near future.
Yeah, as I say, politicians set the deadlines but never meet them, and scientists meet the deadlines but never set them. But here I want to actually now jump straight into the vaccine and all the controversy. But before I do, and of course, Dr. Kang would be best suited to answer about what her objections were. Let me also get one clarification from Dr. Guleria, because this is strictly an apolitical scientific discussion. So I'm sure everyone is in fact being very forthright. So Dr. Guleria, you were wrong when you said that the Covaxin is going to be used just as a backup, correct?
So that's a controversial question. It depends on what you mean by backup.
That you explain.
I'll try and explain that. You see, even now, Covaxin is being used as a support to the main vaccine, which is Covishield. In terms of actual number of doses, the ratio is almost 9:1. People who are getting the vaccine are predominantly getting Covishield. Covaxin is still being produced at a much lesser rate as compared to Covishield. So in terms of that, it is still a backup because bulk of your vaccine production is basically Covishield. So you're not
Can
really...
I argue with Randeep on this one?
I was just about to say that. I detect a smile.
Let me just complete and then we can have this discussion. That is number one. The number two issue was that at that point in time, if you were to critically look at the data, we needed more data. And there was a lot of concern there that we may have an increase in number of cases, and there were all sorts of prediction being done at that point in time. And therefore, more and more people need to be vaccinated. But the data at that point in time was not as robust as one would have liked it to be. We did not have any phase 3 data at that point in time. And that is why there were people who felt that we should wait for some more time till we have some data, both in terms of efficacy, which was only based on phase 2 data and not really robust phase 3 data. So this is the gray area that we had. And this was then left to the expert committee to really ponder upon and weigh the risk and the benefit and come out with what they did as a mid path in terms of saying that this may be given authorization, but it may be only under strict clinical trial phase, which could also be interpreted as a backup.
Okay, so after you retire from the AIIMS director, you're going to take up diplomacy, Dr. Guleria. But Dr. Kang, before you come in, I also like to ask you, because you were one of the first ones being an expert in this field and having being in the team that developed the rotavirus vaccine, you were the first ones to object to sanction or emergency use authorization being given to Covaxin. But did you, for example, know that such authorization had also been given to H1N1 vaccine in 2012, and it goes with the rules that were possibly amended, I think, in 2018, that saying that looking at just the phase 1 and phase 2 trials, that is safety and immunogenicity, you can indeed give emergency use authorization. So 2 questions here. One, what was the basis of your objection? And I'm just saying, as if things were absolutely normal, then your objection is perfectly valid, because unless you look at the efficacy trial data and years pass by, you don't normally give authorization for mass use of the vaccine. But here you objected to even the emergency use authorization. So could you please elaborate on that and comment on Dr. Guleria's response as far as the backup thing is concerned?
Okay, so let's start with our regulations. We've been through a very difficult time in the early following 2010. All clinical trials were stopped. Everybody had a really tough time with the regulators. It was a mess. We have only just begun to emerge from that mess. We now have regulations that are being put in place with a reasonable amount of thought, of borrowing from what WHO, what the FDA, what the stringent regulatory authorities recommend. And it's very important for our country that our regulator is recognized as a quality regulator. Okay? I already have a problem with our Drugs and Cosmetics Act because we equate drugs and vaccines, which is not what most regulators do. When you test a drug, the phase 1 is efficacy, a phase 2 is a pilot, phase 1 is safety, phase 2 is a pilot efficacy, and phase 3 is really validation of efficacy. In a vaccine, your steps are very different. Your steps are safety, immunogenicity, clinical efficacy for the prevention of disease. We have had some missteps in the past where we have licensed vaccines bridging to claiming that immunogenicity was equal to efficacy. We've done this for multiple typhoid vaccines, for example, and this has led to the regulator licensing a vaccine which has then to be, in order to be WHO pre-qualified and required to be used in other countries, has required an additional efficacy trial, which has been done in multiple countries, has been done in the form of challenge studies. So it's like our regulator is not meeting the standards that other people set for vaccines. So I was actually delighted when in September, the regulator came out with a recommendation for the path that would be followed for SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. And it was clear, it was comprehensive, it was aligned to global standards. And in January, they went against their own recommendations, which had been published in September at the height of the pandemic peak in India. They were willing to have a situation where, height of pandemic, you're saying one thing, you're at the absolute trough, and now you change all your rules and allow for emergency use authorization, which, by the way, does not exist in our clinical trial rules. What exists in our clinical trial rules is bypassing all clinical trials, and in a situation of emergency, authorizing any product that has been tested in clinical trials elsewhere. By that rule, if you follow it, you should be allowing Pfizer vaccine to come into India. You should not be asking for bridging trials. You should be allowing AstraZeneca because they have data from outside the country. Okay? And for Covaxin, no need to do clinical trials if you think that it works. But if you are going to follow a process, that process has to apply equally to all vaccines, and that's not what was done. So I have no problem with any vaccine. I've been working with Bharat Biotech for a dozen years now. I think they are a solid company with solid R&D that really make very good vaccines. And I think that this did them damage. I'm delighted that it is a vaccine that works. But if we want our regulatory systems to be really strong, we cannot chop and change. We have to hold ourselves to the highest standards, and we did not do that. In an emergency, I get the point of changing, but then don't say Pfizer we will not allow, but this one we will allow because it is an Indian product. You must have one rule. Second, about influenza vaccines, what you mentioned. Influenza is very different from every other class of vaccine. Every influenza vaccine, every season, is licensed on the basis of only safety and immunogenicity studies. This is because we make new influenza vaccines every year, not just for the pandemic. So we were following a process that already existed. So you can't equate what is a known platform which has been in existence for decades with a completely new infection.
Right. So two points to glean from there. One, Dr. Kang is, so let me ask you directly before I go to Dr. Guleria, who may counter your arguments. In your view, Dr. Kang, do you think because the bridging trials for AstraZeneca, Covishield was also not submitted, do you think even Covishield shouldn't have got emergency use authorization? even though it had conducted trials on 20,000 volunteers, non-Indian volunteers?
Actually, I think Covishield could easily have waited a couple more weeks and gotten a full licensure, because all that is required is efficacy data from somewhere else and a bridging study in India. So if we
Right.
follow the rules, they could have gotten a full licensure. And in fact,
But they still
now
haven't
all of-
completed those studies.
They have the data in their summary of product characteristics that are given with the Covishield vaccine.
It's not peer reviewed, right? It's not yet come out in the open.
Peer reviewed is a whole different ball game. And who would peer review a bridging study in any case? Those very rarely get published. But the actual data themselves are in the packs that are submitted with the vaccine.
Right. The other point before I go to Dr. Guleria is that you're saying that H1N1 vaccine is a different case altogether because there you only rely on safety and immunogenicity, and then you can give those vaccines, administer those vaccines. So the question, Dr. Kang, is that in this situation where people are dying, aren't you as a scientist and a doctor willing to take a chance that if the safety and the immunogenicity of a vaccine against this debilitating virus is good enough, maybe club it or think of it as an H1N1 type of vaccine to maybe, administer so that you could save some lives?
And then you can't have it both ways, right? One, India is doing a brilliant job. Our deaths are very low. Our deaths are 10 times less than the rest of the world, right?
Yeah.
So this is not a very fatal virus. And on the other side, you're making this argument that we must have emergency use authorization when the bulk of people who are going to get the vaccine are not going to suffer severe disease and die, right? So how many lives? So how many lives would you have saved in 2 months? See, we licensed the vaccine beginning of January, beginning of March, we have the results. How many lives would we have saved in those 2 months? You saw what has happened. The vaccination program started on the 16th of January, right? How many people got vaccinated? Of those, how many people would have been likely to die by the time we had the data? So I still make the argument that we don't understand the damage we've done to ourselves by being in too much of a hurry. We could have had such firm standing in the global community if we had just waited.
Right. No, that's a point of view. I have a slight disagreement with it because I wear my Mahatma Gandhi hat and say that even if you are able to save one life, go for it. But let me bring in Dr. Guleria. Before I finally bring in Dr. Laharia, I'm sorry, I'm not ignoring you, Dr. Laharia, but this is a very good to and fro which is happening finally.
I completely agree.
So Dr. Guleria, what do you have to say to Dr. Kang's assessment on 2 points? One, that where was the hurry? We should have waited for 2 months. And on the second, that the emergency use authorization, in fact, should not have been given to either Covishield or Covaxin.
Anand, I have no problem with an emergency use authorization if you have efficacy data.
If you have efficacy,
right?
Correct.
Right now, all vaccines are operating on an emergency use authorization, mostly globally. Yes. And that's only because the paperwork for a BLA just takes so much time to do. That package is humongous and it takes a while. If you've got your top line efficacy data, absolutely give emergency use authorization. And I'm happy with an interim analysis as well. Just show that the vaccine is working. And working does not mean only immunogenicity.
Okay. Dr. Guleria, your response, please.
So I'm a clinician, so I have a slightly different response because you don't want any of your patients to die because of COVID-19, and you did continue to see significant number of patients, especially with comorbidities and elderly, and at times even younger people who argued with me that, you say mortality is low. I have a friend of mine who lost his mother and his wife, and he said, your mortality, you say, is very low, but in my family, it's 50%. Only me and my daughter are left in the family. I've lost my mother and I've lost my wife, who was only 55 years old. I knew her since childhood. So when we talk of mortality, sometimes it depends on how you look at it. And therefore, I would say that this is a dynamic situation. The pandemic is dynamic, and you need to take decisions at a given point in time. They may be wrong. I'm not willing to say that the decisions are always going to be right, but not taking a decision is also not right. And I think at that point in time, the decision was that based on whatever data was available, the benefits seemed to be more than whatever risk there was of the vaccine. And one was willing to accept the fact that maybe the efficacy is not that much, but at least it will give some protection based on the phase 2 trial, and therefore it would be worthwhile to roll it out. Even today, people come and tell me that I think the vaccine rollout was delayed. And we're seeing a spike. If we had started vaccine rollout a month or two earlier, maybe we would have vaccinated a larger number of people and we may not have seen such a big spike that we are now seeing. So there is already a feeling that we rolled out the vaccine much later than what we should have done. So there is actually, I would say, a conflict between the clinical side and as far as pure scientists are concerned, because I do agree, as Dr. Kant said, that from the science point of view and from looking at it very critically, you should have all your data points in before you say that, yes, you should give approval. That means both the safety and the efficacy data, which is robust enough. But there are times when in a pandemic, you have to take that leap of faith, if I may put it that way, and therefore have faith in the product and say, okay, it's worth taking the chance. And I think that's what the regulators did. I'm not part of the expert committee, so I'm just giving you what my feeling was. But I did support it because I felt that at that point in time, it was something that we should have done. It may or may not have been the right decision. Now, if you look back, it seems that it was worth it because whatever now data has emerged does seem to show that the vaccine is effective. Vaccines will continue to have controversy. The AstraZeneca vaccine has faced controversies over the last few days, and many European countries have stopped it for some time. That will continue to happen. That is the dynamic part of it. But that doesn't mean that we should stop the vaccine on a permanent basis. We need to really keep assessing the situation as the vaccine rollout evolves and as the pandemic evolves.
Yeah, spoken like it reminds me of Dr. Ru in, I think, Camus' Plague. But does that response satisfy you, Dr. Kang?
It doesn't, because I think we had enough doses of Covishield to vaccinate all the people that we have vaccinated with Covishield and Covaxin so far. And my worry really is about looking towards a global picture. Every death is a tragedy. I completely agree. And if we could have prevented them, that would have been something that we should look forward to. But vaccines that are unproven being given to people, in hindsight, we have 20/20 vision. But unproven vaccines, can you imagine if the results had turned out to be negative? What would we have been doing now? We would be going back to those 3 million people who have received Covaxin and trying to vaccinate them with Covishield, right?
Isn't that a little bit of an alarmist? I mean, I can completely understand, as Dr. Guleri also mentioned, technically speaking, scientifically speaking, you're absolutely on the dot. But the fact of the matter is that the safety was already analyzed of Covaxin.
It's not about the safety. No one had any questions about the safety, and everybody had a lot of hope, which has been validated, that the vaccine would work. But ethically, there is a question about giving an unproven product to people. That's why you do clinical trials. And this new avatar of a clinical trial mode has never existed before. Okay, there is compassionate use that was used for the Ebola vaccine, but it was done after Ebola efficacy was proven. It was only while we were waiting for licensure that we used the Ebola vaccine. So there is no parallel for India's approach to a clinical trial mode. I am really relieved, really delighted that it all worked out finally for us, but it had the potential to be something that could have been very, very damaging.
Yeah, I mean, it was in many ways a leap of faith. You're right there, because the efficacy right now is 81%. And if it was, it was nowhere near as good as 81%, then you're right. We might have had to vaccinate or revaccinate those people who had been given Covaxin. But Dr. Guleria, have you changed your opinion listening to Dr. Kang, or vice versa? Dr. Kang, have you changed your opinion a little bit? Have you compromised a little bit on your views after hearing each other out?
So if I may start, I think Dr. Kang has a point, and we need to keep that in mind, because we are scientists and we need to have standing internationally also, and need to follow scientific norms. But having said that, we also need to really look how the pandemic evolves, and there are times in a pandemic where decisions are taken which may not be scientifically rational, and we've seen that throughout the year. We started with using hydroxychloroquine. We didn't know whether it'll work or not. Even at one point in time, hydroxychloroquine became whether you were pro-Trump or anti-Trump. It became like that. It has become an issue when you have a pandemic, that you have to look at various drugs, from anti-HIV drugs to hydroxychloroquine, to debate on remdesivir, to plasma. There was a huge thing of giving convalescent plasma, and there were huge plasma banks created in the country. And then we had data which suggested that they may be of no use. Even meta-analysis are now showing that plasma was really of no use. So pandemics are different. You need to really...
Mandeep, you need to generate the evidence. And while we are, we can try experiments, but it should be with the goal of generating evidence.
I think in a pandemic, you need to do both side by side. That's the only point that I'm making.
I think both of you have made some really marvelous points, and I think we're much richer, believe me, after this discussion, because both of your views have appeared independently in the media, and people have kind of, not very sure. But I'm hopeful that, this discussion has really, tempered the situation. And let me now finally, I apologize, Dr. Laharia, but this was a very riveting to and fro between the two eminent, clinicians and scientists. So I just couldn't resist, putting to rest that discussion. But let me come to you finally. And here, as both Dr. Kang and Dr. Guleria talked about our preparation and our being, the fact of the matter is we're good at making vaccines. And we are a world hub. We are distributing vaccines to so many nations. But here is my question. If we are so good at making vaccines, and most of the technologies that are involved in the anti-SARS vaccines, anti-CoV vaccines, are at least 20 to 30 years old. I mean, even if you take the RNA vaccine technology, that is also about 15 to 20 years old. So here is the question. Why were we always late, even in this? Because the genome sequence of the original SARS-CoV was published on Jan 11th, 2020. Moderna filed for clinical trials on Jan 13th, 2 days. They took 2 days to design their vaccine, and they put it in the, for clinical trials. You had the culture of SARS that was done by CDC in Atlanta on February 14th, I think. Our National Institute of Virology did it almost 1.5 to 2 months late. Had we done it as fast as Moderna or, let's say Pfizer, we could have actually had the complete phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials result by maybe November. So all this controversy wouldn't have arisen. So do you think once again we missed the bus, and who is responsible for this?
Well, I don't think we were late or we missed the bus, because in case of both Oxford and in Moderna, they were working on the similar platform for different vaccines. So all they need to do is quickly switch from on the same platform from one pathogen to another pathogen. And that's how they could save the time. The Oxford University was working on MERS virus and on the same platform, and then they used for SARS-CoV-2. So they had done a lot of background work before moving to this vaccine, and that's how they could save time. India, I believe, has done fairly well and fast using the technique and approach which they have used for developing Covaxin. But I don't want to stop before I touch upon two other aspects quickly. That one, I really like the debate and discourse between Dr. Guleria and Dr. Kang, and they are co-author. Three of us have written a book. In the book, we have argued that the victory against pandemic would not be complete only with the disappearance or once when the pandemic is over. The victory will be really can be called victory when we derive and learn lessons from the pandemic experience and then put those lessons into the practice. So the kind of debate which we saw or heard just now is will help India to derive those lessons and be prepared for the future epidemics and pandemics. So that's the one important thing, that we need to have similar debates and dialogues where we derive lessons. And the second part I want to highlight is, which I really wish that you had asked me that question, but you did not. So you asked Dr. Guleria the question regarding whether India needs a specific body for pandemic response.
Right.
And my answer is no. The reason is that epidemic, the outbreaks, epidemic and pandemics keep happening. The only difference in these three terminology is the geographical area. Like every outbreak is a localized, which happens to one part or other part, smaller locality. Every single day in one part or other part, outbreak keep happening. Epidemics are bigger geographical areas, slightly rare, and pandemics are very rare. But good part is that for all three, whether epidemic, outbreak or pandemic, the response is similar. What is required? You need to have a good surveillance system. You need to have a trained people. You need to have a well-functioning system. And if you have all these three at a local level or bigger level, you will be prepared for pandemic also. So India need to start, or all countries need to start preparing for outbreaks. That wherever the particular case is happening, we need to have a surveillance system, trained manpower, stronger health system, and that will prepare us for a future pandemic. So prepare for localized intervention, and we will be prepared for pandemics. We don't need a separate body, and that good answer is a health system is coming. And that is also part of the learning which we need to carry, and that's when our response and global community response to pandemic will be successful if we learn. And that will also prepare us for the future pandemics.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think that was really required. And I think we've completely run out of time. I'm going to be thrashed by the organizers. I did not see the clock, but it's been an absolutely riveting discussion. And it's been a real pleasure and an honor to host it. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.